Hi, and welcome to the Futures Workshop, a podcast where we talk to the world's leading futures thinkers about tools they've developed to help imagine and shape the future. This is episode 6. It's an even-numbered episode, which means we're doing a workshop. We're going deep with one of the tools. Now, this episode, like all our even-numbered episodes, is designed for facilitators and practitioners who want practical examples of how to use these futures tools in their work. If you're more of a casual listener, you may wish to skip this workshop episode and move on to our next interview coming up in episode 7. The podcast is led by Victoria Mulligan, a futures thinker from Auckland, New Zealand. Victoria, what's the plan today?
Kia ora. Today we'll be running a workshop drawing on backcasting. If you haven't already caught episode 5 of this podcast, my chat with Sarah McCartney from the Pacific community, I really encourage you to give it a listen. It'll give you some great background and make today's session a lot easier to follow. But before we get into it, let's start by reminding ourselves what backcasting is and why it's important. Backcasting is like reverse engineering the future. Instead of starting with where we are now and planning forward, we start with where we want to end up and work backward to figure out the steps that could get us there. The beauty of starting in the future is that it shifts us away from focusing on what's not possible and opens up the conversation to imagine what is possible. This kind of thinking helps identify the key processes, structures and cultures that need to change in order to achieve our desired future.
Sounds good, and as always, you're doing a hypothetical workshop with a hypothetical issue you're looking at. What's today's topic?
Today's session, we're going to take the focal issue of eliminating food deserts in my hometown, Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, by 2050. A food desert is an area where residents have limited or no access to affordable and nutritious food. To put it simplistically, it's a suburb or cluster of suburbs that don't have a supermarket. This issue disproportionately affects low-income communities, leading to poor health outcomes and deepening inequalities. In the room with us today, we have a group of participants working across the food system, including local council representatives, government officials, and some local NGOs. Each bring unique insights into how we can move forward on this issue. So let's get started. Auckland is a city where every neighbourhood has thriving local food hubs, urban gardens are woven into the fabric of communities, and equitable access to fresh, affordable food is a given. The city is known for its vibrant local food systems, where diverse markets, cooperative grocers, and food sharing initiatives ensure that no one is left behind. People can walk or cycle to fresh produce within 10 minutes of their home, and the strong community networks make sure that food security is a right, not a privilege. Let's get started by imagining exactly how this future differs from Auckland today. I've just described a vision for 2050 where food deserts are a thing of the past. I'd like each of you to take a moment to visualise this future. Picture a city where fresh produce is abundant in every neighbourhood, community gardens flourish, and the food system is local, resilient, and inclusive. Now let's think about what's different in that future compared to where we are today. What's driving change in that future? Consider how policies, societal shifts, technological advancements, and community engagement have evolved.
One big change is that local governments have really started focusing on food equity. They've got policies that back urban farming and give grocery stores incentives to open in areas that need them most.
Yeah, zoning reforms are huge here. By making sure land is available for urban farms and food hubs, and offering incentives for grocery stores to pop up in low-income neighbourhoods, we've made fresh, healthy food way more accessible.
I'm seeing communities becoming way more self-sufficient. Urban farms and community gardens are now at the heart of neighbourhoods. They're not just places to grow food, they're where people connect and they support each other.
And technology's playing a big role. We've got smart logistics that link up surplus food with people who need it, and vertical filing is pretty standard now, even in high-density areas.
Perfect. I think you're capturing the spirit of this futuring really well. Let's move on and think about how we got here. Take a moment to individually brainstorm on post-its the key milestones that got us to this vision, working backward from the future. I usually allow about 10 minutes for this solo brainstorming. Once the group is done, we'll come together to share and consolidate as a group, typically on a whiteboard or butcher paper on the wall with a timeline sketched out from now to 2050. Okay, so we've explored what 2050 looks like in our ultimate vision, but now I'd like you to take me to 2045. What happened then to make that 2050 milestone possible?
Well, I'd say by 2045 we've got comprehensive zoning reforms in place. This opened up vacant lots to be transformed into urban farms and markets, plus there were already incentives to get grocers set up in areas that were underserved before.
And now let's look at 2040. What needed to happen by then?
Okay, working backwards, by 2040, public-private partnerships locked in sustainable funding for food hubs and urban farms. And that stability is what really allowed those projects to scale up across the city.
Cool. And what happened in 2035 that set the stage for those partnerships?
In 2035, citywide education programs were fully in motion, teaching communities the benefits of local food systems and building up the infrastructure for urban farms and co-ops.
Okay, and moving back to 2030 now, what were the critical steps there?
By 2030, we already had pilot programs running in key neighbourhoods to test different models for food distribution and community engagement. These pilots laid the groundwork for scaling up more broadly.
And finally, back in 2025, what actions were crucial right from the start?
In 2025, coalitions of advocacy groups and local councils were coming together, setting the stage for food equity policies. We also kicked off some early awareness campaigns to get the community involved and to build support.
The group in this example has identified most of these milestones as events that are either fully or partially within their control. It can be valuable to take a moment to really assess the level of control we have over these outcomes. Some groups find it helpful to assign a score to each event, like a 1 for fully within our control, 2 for partially in our control, and 3 for outside of our control. While other groups might prefer to have a more open discussion about this. For the events where we have full or partial control, it's crucial to dig a bit deeper and really explore what's happening at each stage. Okay, we've got a great list of milestones there. Now let's think about what impact each of these milestones has on delivering our future. Who benefits? Who might lose out? What or who might resist this change, and how likely is it to occur? What are the key steps we need to take right now? And what enablers or barriers should we consider? Now I'm going to give you 20 minutes to consider these questions individually for each of the milestones. Then I'm going to ask us to come back together as a group to discuss. The question as to whether to do this individually or in small groups is really up to the facilitator. Today I'm imagining a group of 6 to 8 people, so we can do this part of the exercise individually. If this was a larger group, I'd ask people to work in small breakout groups of 3 to 5 to run through this activity. Okay, time's up. Let's come back together and let's start in 2050. Give me some more detail on the questions that we outlined earlier.
Well, when it comes to impacts by 2050, when all the neighbourhoods have these fully running, community-owned food hubs, obviously the impact is huge. Everyone's got easy access to fresh food. Public health is way better. But if we rewind to 2045, we're getting there because zoning reforms have finally made it easier to create spaces for urban farms, especially in low-income areas. Of course, property developers probably aren't too thrilled about losing out on land. At that point, we'd really need solid long-term funding, clear policies, and some smart strategies to handle those competing interests.
Okay, let's hear from the rest of the group as we work our way back to 2025.
By 2040, we're seeing public-private partnerships really kick in, locking down sustainable funding for these food hubs and urban farms. That stable support is key to scaling things up across the city, but early on there were a lot of concerns about whether this would even be profitable. To get past that, we have to show everyone the social and economic upsides and make sure our plans fit into bigger city goals.
Jumping back to 2035, the education initiatives really start making a difference. Communities are getting involved and taking ownership of their food systems. But not everyone's on board at first. Some folks are just sceptical about urban farming. We really leaned on partnerships with schools and community centres to push through, but tackling the misinformation and doubts was a bit of a hurdle.
By 2030, we're running pilot programs to see what works and what doesn't for community-led food systems. The results are promising, but scaling up is a whole different challenge. Local leadership and community buy-in make a big difference, but finding enough resources to keep it going is tough.
Rolling back to 2027, urban farms and food hubs are already popping up in areas that really need them. The biggest pushback comes from people who want to keep things as they are, but by building strong alliances and getting our message out there, we managed to get past most of that resistance.
Awesome, that's exactly the kind of detailed analysis we're after at that stage. Alright, when it comes to events that are out of our control, like bigger zoning reforms or shifts in national food policies, we need to think about a different set of questions. Who's really in control here? What happens if these changes don't go through? How can we push things in the right direction to make sure they do? And what steps do we need to take to make our influence count?
Well, for those zoning reforms in 2045, it's mostly in the hands of local governments and policymakers. If they don't follow through, we're going to struggle with getting enough land for urban farming, who could really slow us down. To nudge things in our favour, we'd probably need to rally some strong advocacy groups, get some community leaders involved, and just keep hammering home the benefits with some solid evidence.
Yes, identifying who has control and finding ways to influence those factors is key. We also need to think about how we position ourselves to take action when opportunities arise. By focusing on where we have leverage, we can still shape the outcomes even when the control isn't directly in our hands. Now, coming to the end of our backcasting exercise, we've covered both the events that we can control and those that are outside our direct control. And so we'll start to pull everything together into an action plan. This plan will need to identify priority areas, the immediate steps that we can take, and who is accountable for these. We need to consider the partnerships that need to be formed and the advocacy work required to keep momentum going. Okay, we'll finish our imagined workshop there, and I hope you got some value out of that. Backcasting can be used as a very useful addition to visioning or any other scenario method. The process starts by developing a preferred or desirable future and then working backward to identify major events and data points that generated that future. This leads to identifying a potential trajectory or how it all might happen and allows organisations to consider what actions, policies and programs are needed today that will connect the future to the present.
Thanks, Victoria. That concludes episode 6, a quick look at backcasting in practice. We'll be back in a few days with another interview in episode 7. Thanks so much for listening.
Ka kite, see you later.